What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka NYPrepper. In this video I want to talk to you guys about why I conceal carry a .44 Magnum, and I want to talk about some of the benefits of conceal carrying a big bore revolver. Now, most people think of a big bore revolver as something that you should only carry in the woods and something that over penetrates, but I want to give you guys some food for thought and talk about the benefits of carrying a big bore revolver, because so far I've only heard of people bashing big bore revolvers and saying how you shouldn't carry a big bore revolver and how they're too slow and you can't reload them and they over penetrate and they're antiquated. So I'm out here shopping, and I'm in Pennsylvania. I don't live in New York anymore, and I'm carrying my .44 Magnum here in this fanny pack. So here is my .44 Magnum Performance Center, and there it is right there, .44 Magnum. Okay, now if I was carrying this in New York, I would probably be sitting in the back of a squad car pretty soon, because open carry is illegal and displaying your firearm in public is illegal. But here in the free state of Pennsylvania, I can do that without being afraid of getting arrested. So I want to talk to you guys about the benefits of a big bore revolver for EDC. All right, guys, so what are the benefits of carrying a big bore revolver every single day as your concealed carry weapon? Look at these giant piles of snow. Check this out. So a lot of people say that revolvers in general are an old platform and they're outdated and they shouldn't really be considered a serious self-defense tool, and I highly disagree with that. First of all, revolvers have been used longer than semi-automatics. They've been around longer than semi-automatics in general, so that's something to consider. Revolvers have stopped more bad guys than semi-automatics have. Even if you go back to the 1800s, the cowboys would carry single-action revolvers, and a lot of the sheriffs back in the day would get into gunfights with single-action revolvers with the outlaws. And then later on, you had the .357 Magnum revolvers, which were standard issue for many police across the United States. They were considered a standard issue sidearm for many police forces, pretty much from the 50s all the way until the 90s. And even up until 2000, some large police departments were still issuing .357 Magnum revolvers. So revolvers have proven themselves. They have withstood the test of time. And I always talk about that when it comes to selecting firearms for self-defense. You always want your firearm to be something that's been tested extensively and used and proven in the real world, not just on a shooting range, but in the real world, in real world situations. And most revolvers that are in production today have withstood the test of time. So that's something to consider. Obviously, the reloading is slower and you don't have as much capacity. The recoil is a lot higher than a 9mm Glock. But like my .44 Magnum, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen it in my videos. It's basically the same size as a Glock 9mm with a 4 or 5 inch barrel. Weighs about the same. It's about 34 ounces empty. About the same as a Glock. Weighs about the same size. However, one .44 Magnum is equivalent to the same power as probably 4 9mm rounds. So that's something to consider. For every one shot with the .44 Magnum, it's like getting hit 4 times with a 9mm. It's the same amount of energy as 4 9mm rounds. Most 44 Magnums can generate around 1,000 foot-pounds, upwards of 1,200 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Even in my snub-nose barrel revolver, I'm still getting around 1,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. That's easily 3 times the energy of a 9mm 115 grain FMJ. So yeah, the capacity is lower. I only have 6 rounds in the cylinder, but we're talking about concealed carry. We're not talking about kicking in doors, arresting people, going after bad guys. That's not what concealed carry is. A lot of people confuse concealed carry with police work and military work. As a civilian, as a citizen, you're not going after bad guys. You're not kicking their door in trying to arrest them against their will. When you do that, whether it's a bad guy or any human being, if you try to forcefully take somebody against their will into physical imprisonment, no matter who they are, they're going to resist in some way. So in that situation, you want a lot of capacity. You want fast reloads because you don't know what you're dealing with, okay? But as a civilian, as a citizen, your job is to defend, okay? You're not performing offensive maneuvers. You're not performing offensive tactics. You're not kicking in doors. You're not trying to pull someone out of a vehicle and arrest them. You're not confronting people. That's not what you're supposed to do as a concealed carry permit holder or as a citizen, okay? As a law-abiding gun owner, you're supposed to defend and break contact and let the police deal with it. That's it. You're not trying to play Navy SEAL at your local mall, okay? Your job is to defend, use the least amount of force necessary to defend yourself and defend others, and break contact and let the authorities deal with it. That's what you're supposed to do. I don't need 100 rounds to stop a bad guy. If I need 100 rounds, if I need 3 magazines to stop a bad guy, as a concealed carry holder, not somebody who's kicking doors in, as somebody who's a citizen, I don't need that much ammunition to stop a threat, okay? And like I said, 144 Magnum is the equivalent of 3 or 4 9mm, so I don't need 4 or 5 shots to put down a bad guy. All I need is 1 shot, because 1 shot of a 44 Magnum is good enough to drop even a black bear, depending on the ammunition that you use. So the key thing is being accurate, practicing shot placement, getting comfortable with recoil. The one good thing about revolvers is they're simple to use, and in a stressful situation, you don't have to worry about safeties. All you have to do is deploy the weapon and squeeze the trigger. You don't have to worry about taking a safety off like with a lot of semi-automatics. Also, because the trigger poundage is a lot higher than, let's say, a Glock. Now, Glocks don't have safeties on them, but they only have a 4 or 5 pound trigger, so it's easy to have an accidental discharge. Versus a revolver, you have a hammer, and you can use the hammer as a safety, and I've talked about that in some of my other videos. You can take your thumb, and you could put your thumb underneath the hammer spur, and that acts as your safety when you're withdrawing your firearm from the holster or putting it back in, so you don't accidentally squeeze the trigger as you're putting your gun back in your holster. You take your thumb and you put it under the hammer spur, and this way it prevents the trigger from being squeezed all the way and letting the sear go, okay? So also the trigger poundage on a revolver is high enough that it acts as a safety mechanism. Most revolvers have a trigger poundage in double action of about 10 to 14 pounds. So that's not a trigger poundage that's really easy to accidentally discharge. It's pretty heavy poundage. You need a deliberate squeeze to get that hammer to fall. You know, it's not something that you're gonna just accidentally touch and it's gonna go off. So simplicity, Reliability is another one. If something is wrong with one of the rounds, all you have to do is squeeze the trigger again and the hammer will fall on the next round. The cylinder will rotate. The hammer will fall on the next round. You don't have to worry about clearing a jam and any of that stuff, okay? All you have to do is just squeeze the trigger. The cylinder rotates, hammer falls on the next round. So that's another thing, because you can practice reloads at the range as much as you want, but in a stressful situation, clearing a jam may be a lot harder than if you're at the range when you're very relaxed, okay? You may forget certain steps, and you can make the jam a lot worse, or it may take longer to clear the jam. But with a revolver, you don't have to worry about that. All you have to do is just squeeze the trigger again, and the hammer will fall on the next round, okay? So that's another big advantage. You can also get 8-shot revolvers now. You can get moon clips. Moon clips make reloading very fast. Even speed loaders, you should be able to reload a revolver in just a couple of seconds with a speed loader. I can reload my revolvers in 5 seconds with a speed loader, okay? It sounds like a lot of time, but 5 seconds to do a reload with a revolver is pretty fast. And like I said, you know, if you need more than 6 rounds to stop a threat with a, you know, any gun, let alone a 44 Magnum or 357 Magnum, then you need to go to the range more and you need to practice your fundamentals, because quality is more important than quantity. These days, everybody's thinking about quantity and getting the most amount of rounds on target, and that's great, but it's really the first round that's most important. Any situation, whether you're a hunter, whether you're a safari guide, whether you're a police officer, whether you're a concealed carry permit holder, whatever, either one of those, any of those people, it's always the first shot that counts the most. It's not the 5th shot, it's not the 10th shot, it's not the 30th shot. It's the first round that usually makes the most difference. And everybody these days focuses on dumping multiple mags and getting the 30th round on target rather than the first round. If the first round gets on target, you don't need 30 rounds. You don't need 30 rounds to stop a threat. If you need 30 rounds to stop a threat, then you shouldn't even be there in the first place. Then you're way over your head. You know, you're not going to be engaging an active shooter. If they have an AK-47 and all you have is a 9mm and they have multiple magazines, there's not much, you're outgunned, you know. Obviously, it's better than nothing, but you have to be realistic. What are the threats? You're not kicking doors in. You're not raiding compounds. You're carrying a pistol for personal protection, okay? So now, depending on what part of the country you live in, it could be different. If you live in an area with a lot of gangs and they're very well armed, then maybe a revolver's not a good choice for you. But generally speaking, in most situations, you don't need to have ultra high capacity for concealed carry. Now, I'm not against high capacity. I love high capacity. I have several high capacity firearms. I love it, you know. I think it's excellent. But I feel very comfortable with a solid steel revolver that's reliable, has a lot of power. I don't have to worry about clearing a jam. And even if you're dealing with somebody who's armored up, let's say you have a bad guy who's wearing body armor. It has happened before. It's not common, but it's happened with a lot of active shooters. Some of these active shooters buy body armor, and you know, they think that by buying body armor, it slows down the process of stopping them so they can kill more people while they're on their rampage. And we've seen that many times. If you're dealing with an active shooter that's wearing body armor, if you have a big bore revolver like even a 357 Magnum or 44 Magnum, you can do a lot more damage with that to the body armor than with a 9mm, because of the kinetic energy, the impact on the body armor. It's gonna knock that person down, if not break their ribs or rupture organs because of the kinetic energy. And I've actually done a video of my 500 Magnum versus some level 3 body armor, and the 500 Magnum didn't penetrate the level 3 body armor, but it absolutely destroyed the body armor and left some huge holes, some huge dents in the body armor, and I would not want to wear that body armor while somebody's shooting at me with a 500 Magnum. Now, I'm not saying you should carry a 500 Magnum on the street, but a 44 Magnum is much more reasonable. Now, you don't have to use full power 44 Magnum loads. You can also use milder loads, and with milder loads, you can duplicate the same ballistics as a 45 ACP. You can use 44 special loads, which push a 200 grain bullet at around 1,000 feet per second or less, and pretty much you can duplicate a 45 ACP. But you can also go full power. And I want to talk to you guys about over-penetration. Over-penetration is probably the biggest thing that makes people scared to carry a Magnum cartridge or something like a 10 millimeter, 357, 44 Magnum. And I think the whole thing about over-penetration is honestly overblown. First of all, a lot of police officers, like I mentioned, carried 357 Magnums for decades. 357 Magnum revolvers were carried longer than Glocks. And there were never really any widespread issues with over-penetration. And a lot of these cops were big city cops. For example, New York City Police Department had a standard issue sidearm of a 357 Magnum revolver for decades. And then later in the 90s and in the early 2000s, they switched to semi-automatics and Glocks, and they phased out the 357. But the 357 Magnum revolver was standard issue sidearm for the New York City Police Department for decades. And there weren't any widespread issues with over-penetration. The only reason they discontinued the 357 Magnum as a standard issue is because the recoil was pretty fierce, and a lot of the newer recruits are basically wimps. You know, if you look at police today in general and just society today in general compared to 50 years ago, you know, men were real men back in the day. They were burlier, they lifted weights, they played sports. Nowadays, you know, you have a lot more female police officers, and for them to handle the recoil of a 357 Magnum is kind of asking a lot. And a lot of the men today, I hate to say it, but a lot of men have, you know, become wussified, you know, and that's just a fact. And that's a big reason why they switched from the 357 Magnum revolver. It's not because it was over penetrating and it wasn't getting the job done. It's because of the recoil, and then obviously capacity and slower reloading. Not as good in tactical situations, of course, that's another thing. But there weren't any widespread issues with the 357 Magnum over penetrating. So my whole thing with over penetration is simple. No firearm should ever be considered to be safe to use against a bad guy if you know that there's innocent civilians standing behind the bad guy. Okay? I don't care what you're carrying, even a 22, I would never feel comfortable taking a shot at a bad guy, even with a 22 pistol, if I knew that there was a chance that I could hit somebody standing behind the bad guy. So I think the whole thing with over penetration is overblown, and I think that a lot of people get this false sense of security. They think that, oh, I have a 380 or I have a 9 millimeter with some good hollow points and I don't have to worry about over penetration. That's false. Any cartridge can over penetrate a human being. Human beings don't have a lot of flesh. We're not large, creatures. All right, it's very easy to penetrate through a human torso, even with a 22. So you should never get that false sense of security that, oh, I'm carrying a low recoil, low power cartridge and I don't have to worry about over penetration. That's wrong, and that goes against the basics of gun safety. You should always be aware of not just what your target is, but what's behind the target, okay? Even if I'm carrying a 22, I would never discharge my firearm at a threat if I knew that there was somebody standing behind the threat. So what does that mean? That means whether I carry a 22 or whether I carry a 44 Magnum, it doesn't matter, because I'm not going to pull the trigger on a bad guy if I know that there's a potential I could over-penetrate and hit somebody behind the bad guy, okay? You should never discharge your firearm at a threat if there's somebody behind the threat. So the whole thing about over-penetration is basically pointless, because you're not going to squeeze your trigger on a threat if you know that there's somebody behind the threat. Because really, like I said, no bullet is guaranteed not to over-penetrate. And you don't want to get into that false sense of security that, oh, I have a small caliber, I don't have to worry about it. I can go into a crowded area with lots of people and I could, discharge my weapon at a bad guy and I don't have to worry about penetration and ricochets. And that's not true. You really don't know what could happen, and it's not responsible as a gun owner to discharge your firearm at a bad guy lawfully if you know that there's people behind the bad guy. So that's why the over-penetration thing is pointless. So just wanted to give you guys these things to think about. Big bore revolvers, 357, 44 Magnum. I wouldn't go bigger than 44 Magnum in my opinion. 45 Colt is fine. But I really think that a big bore revolver is a great option for concealed carry. 357 Magnum, 44 Magnum, 45 Long Colt, anything in that range. I wouldn't go above that, just because, number one, the frames on those handguns that are bigger are just too large to conceal, and it's just too much power. It's unnecessary. But 44 Magnum, 357 Magnum, you got stopping power, you got reliability, you don't have to worry about clearing jams, you don't have to worry about taking a safety off. It's just much more simple to use in a stressful situation. So that's pretty much it, guys. I just feel very comfortable knowing that I have a Magnum revolver with plenty of stopping power that I can deploy against a threat. No matter what the situation is, if the threat is wearing body armor, if the threat is shooting at me behind cover and I have to penetrate through cover, I know that it's going to get the job done. And I know that it can get the job done with authority and stop the threat with authority rather than just barely stopping the threat. So you want to stop the threat quickly. You don't want to stop the threat barely and have to dump an entire magazine just to stop one bad guy. We've seen that happen many times with 9mm. Sometimes it takes 5 or 6 shots for police officers to drop just a small crackhead that's charging at them. So that's pretty much it, guys. Thanks for watching. Take care. God bless. And don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.